Welcome to ANN Satellite Television. Welcome back to the English Hour. Our guest today is Bayan Sami Abdul Rahman, the High Representative of the Kurdistan Regional Government here in the United Kingdom. Bayan has also been elected to the Leadership Council of the Kurdistan Democratic Party, which is the strongest and most powerful political body in today's Kurdistan.
It was very hard to bring you back into the hall. It looks like you all have a lot to talk about.
Bayan has been in this country for a number of years, and it is an honor to have her with us. She's quite a figure in Kurdish politics, quite a figure as in our own diplomatic community. And she would, in fact, if Kurdistan was a state, she would be ambassador here. And she's perhaps Kurdistan's most outspoken representative of interest.
Business and politics. Great combination.
Bayan, it's good to see you here today on ANN Television. I wanted to ask you something about what brought you into public life. Of course, you had this tremendous tragedy, which our listeners may not be aware of. You lost your brother and your father in a terrible, brutal suicide bombing in 2004. And they were major figures in Kurdish politics. That really thrust you into this new life, really, I guess, in tragic circumstances.
Well, first I'd like to thank you for inviting me to ANN. Yes, you're right. On February the 1st, 2004, there was a twin suicide bombing in Erbil, the capital of the Kurdistan region. And altogether 98 people were killed. Some of them were children. Among those killed were my father and my elder brother. My father at the time was the Deputy Prime Minister of the Kurdistan region. He was a veteran of the Kurdish movement. He'd been in politics from the 50s and 60s onwards. So he was a major figure in Kurdistan and Iraq, and I would say in the Middle East. And of course a major figure in my life. He was my father. And so it was a tragedy that was a great blow to us as a family and to Kurdistan. However, I have to say that unfortunately the people of Kurdistan have suffered many tragedies, and we are a resilient people, and we pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and we continue. And as a family we did that as well. In addition to my brother Salah, who passed away with my father, I have two other siblings, one brother and one sister. Along with my mother, we picked ourselves up after 2004 and continued with our lives. For me personally, that did mean a change of career. I had been a journalist for 17 years before this event. I worked in various newspapers in the UK. The most recent job I had was at the Financial Times. And to be honest, before the events of 2004, I had been talking to my father about leaving journalism and going into politics. Perhaps our idea initially was to have a gentle entry into Kurdish politics, maybe working in his office, assisting him. We then talked about perhaps a higher profile position in the Kurdistan regional government. And before we could execute these plans, tragedy struck. And so in a way I was executing a plan that we had already discussed by leaving journalism and becoming the Kurdistan regional government representative.
And now you're a seasoned, well, both politician and ambassador, if you can be both things. And you would, I mean, if Kurdistan were a state, you would be the ambassador for the KRG, or for the Kurdistan, state of Kurdistan. The $64,000 question maybe first. Do you aspire to statehood for your nation? I mean, is that what you'd like to see, independence for Kurdistan?
Well, as President Barzani has said many times, it's our right as a people to have an independent state. And there's no shame in saying so or in aspiring to have an independent Kurdish state. I think there is a great sense of injustice among all Kurds from all parts of Kurdistan, that history has been unjust towards us. So yes, we do aspire to an independent state, but I think we also have to be realistic. The borders that have divided Kurdistan do exist. We in Kurdistan region are part of Iraq, and we should live with the cards that have been dealt to us. We should live with the realities that surround us. So while that may be an aspiration and a dream, we are also pragmatic, and we want the best for our people, particularly considering the tragic history of our people. We want the best for our people today and tomorrow. And if that means being part of Iraq, making Iraq successful, making Iraq democratic, then that is what we will do.
Interesting. So you see for the immediate future anyway, you see Kurdistan remaining a vibrant part of Iraq, and relationships with the center are very strained, however, over a number of key issues like Kirkuk. But you do see that you don't see Iraq splitting up. I mean, many people talk of Iraq fragmenting. You don't see that happening.
People have been talking about Iraq fragmenting since 2003, if not before, and so far it's held together. I think the key to holding Iraq together is democracy, and it is federalism. Iraq is made up of different peoples. It is a country made of two nations, Kurds and Arabs. It is a country made of two sects, main sects, Sunnis and Shias. It is a country where we have Christians, Yazidis, and many others. So if the state recognizes that, enables everybody to live as equal citizens, if the government is fair to everybody, whether we're Sunni, Shia, Kurd, Christian, Muslim, then Iraq can be a very powerful and very successful state. We have incredible riches in Iraq, and we have incredibly talented people in Iraq. What we don't have so far is a coherent government policy that uses those assets for the betterment of all of the people of Iraq. That's really the key to holding Iraq together.
And there are two big issues that divide the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and of course Kurdistan goes wider if we were talking about the Kurdish people, and we'll come to that, but the Kurdistan region of Iraq and the central government are, well, for want of a better phrase, are soil and oil. I mean, they're the two issues. They are the disputed territories and the resources themselves, and they're in some ways linked. And in terms of resources, you want, as I understand it, the right to develop your own oil resources, and then to collect the revenue for that, and then share that with the central government pot, as opposed to the central government view of things, which is that they would like to collect the revenue from Kurdish oil resources and share that with you. That's the big, I mean, it sounds complicated, but it isn't really. It's a question of who sells the oil is the big dividing issues as far as KRG and the central government is concerned.
There are many issues of disagreement between the Kurdistan regional government and Baghdad. With regards to oil and gas, we don't want the right. We have the right already. It's already in the constitution. The 2005 constitution, which was voted in by the vast majority of people who voted, and that was a majority of the people, does give the KRG the right to exploit newly discovered oil fields. Well, they are all newly discovered. Our oil industry in Kurdistan effectively started in 2006 or 7. There were a few things before that, but as an industry it really started in 2006 and 7. So the constitution is quite clear that we have that right. The dispute with Baghdad really essentially comes down to whether Iraq should remain a centralized country or whether it should be federal and there should be democracy. From our perspective, the Kurdish perspective, centralization has resulted in catastrophe in Iraq. Our people suffered terrible injustices for decades, and the peak of that was the genocide in the 1980s. In 1 year alone, in less than a year, in Operation Anfal, where chemical weapons were used, in less than a year, 182,000 people were killed. That was in just one operation that lasted about 8 or 9 months. And that, in addition to what happened in Halabja in 1983, 8,000 men and boys from the Barzani clan disappeared, and we're now finding their bodies buried in the south. In the late 70s, tens of thousands of Fayli Kurds, Shia Kurds, disappeared or were killed. So we have suffered great injustices. This was through a centralization policy. We will not return to centralization from our perspective. So the issue of oil and gas, from our perspective, the constitution is clear. Newly discovered oil fields, the regions have the right to manage them. So from our perspective, we have that right enshrined in the constitution. What we don't have in Iraq, and we don't understand why, is we don't have a hydrocarbons law, and we don't have a revenue sharing law. These two laws would resolve many of the issues that we have with Baghdad, but they don't want to discuss it. Other issues, outstanding issues that we have, as you said earlier, the disputed territories. Article 140 of the Constitution set out a mechanism that was fair and transparent for dealing with normalizing the disputed territories, having a census, allowing people who were forced out of those territories to come back, giving the settlers in those territories some kind of compensation so they can leave, and allowing a referendum. But this has never been implemented.
Now these areas, I mean, we're talking about areas that are partly Kurdish, in many instances partly Arab, or indeed in Kirkuk it's partly Turkoman as well. You yourself, I mean, we're talking about quite a swathe of Iraq, because these disputed areas, at least from an outsider's perspective, skirt what we regard as the Kurdish regional area, or particularly because, and they come, at the one end you've got up near the Syrian border, you've got the part of Iraq your family comes from, Sinjar, and it runs right down to Diyala province at the other end. These are, and through Nineveh province, they're some of the hottest spots in Iraq, areas fiercely disputed in some senses, even at a local level. Do you see, do you envision a way forward that these issues can be resolved? Basically, we're talking about whether these areas have their own form of autonomy, or they join the Kurdish region, or they stay with the center. That's the issue, isn't it, really?
That's right, and I should also point out that the border that marks out the Kurdistan region, which is administered by the Kurdistan regional government, this was a border that was decided unilaterally by Saddam Hussein. So I don't know why this border is considered sacred. Half of Kurdistan is a disputed territory. So that's from our perspective, half of our land and a great chunk of our population are not governed by the Kurdistan regional government, and we believe they want to be part of the Kurdistan region, but so far they haven't been given the opportunity, even though according to the constitution they should have the opportunity to choose, as you say, whether they join the Kurdistan region, whether they stay as a self-governing governorate,
Yes.
or whether they decide to be governed purely by Baghdad. Whatever they decide, we will accept. But the problem is they're not being given the opportunity to decide.
But it's not, I mean, it has to be a priority from everybody's perspective. I wonder whether, sometimes I wonder whether the Kurdistan regional government, whether the economic independence is more of a priority than looking after the issues of the disputed territories like Kirkuk, because if it were a major priority, surely, I mean, Kurdistan is the kingmaker as far as any Iraq government is concerned. They can't form a government without the Kurdish vote. Then if a census were a priority or whatever, you'd be driving it through as a negotiating tactic to enable the formation of a government, surely.
Well, in the last elections, the elections took place in 2010.
Yes.
And it took us almost a year to form a government. And in the end, it was an initiative by President Barzani that brought all of the parties together in Erbil, where an agreement was signed, which was known as the Erbil Agreement. Based on that agreement, the Kurds, the Kurdish leadership, gave its support to Prime Minister Maliki, and a government was formed. The Erbil Agreement had about 20 points, including census, including resolving the disputed territories, including hydrocarbons and revenue sharing law, including the payment of the Peshmerga salaries out of the Iraqi defense budget. All of these issues were in the Erbil Agreement, that these would be issues that the next government would look at and would deal with. Not a single one has been dealt with. So it's not as if we forget this when it's the critical moment. We remember it, it's always at the forefront of our minds. The problem is, and this is something that we've seen repeatedly, when the Kurds are needed, all promises are made to us. It's a little bit like a beautiful woman being wooed for marriage, and then
Yes.
once the marriage takes place, the husband is a philanderer and disappears.
Yeah, okay.
And I'm afraid we've been in that situation, and we will try to make sure that this time round we're not in that situation, that any promises that are made to the Kurdish bloc are kept this time.
Because you have, I mean, in a sense, de facto, you have got control of the oil money. So even though there's no agreement with Baghdad on how to run oil issues, and it is a hugely distressing point of discontinuity, point of tension between you and Baghdad, that is in practice resolved for the moment because you're selling the oil. What is not resolved is the Kurdish region issues like Kirkuk, and I suppose that's. Who do we blame? Are we going to blame the central government, or are we going to blame the KRG? You can't entirely blame the central government. It takes two, doesn't it, to really push these issues forward, the disputed territories, or.
Well, from our side, we've done everything that's been required, and we're ready at any time to go ahead with a normalization process whereby the people who belonged in Kirkuk and other places like Sinjar can reclaim their properties, their homes. As I said, the settlers who were brought in are compensated somehow, and a transparent process of a census and so on takes place. We're ready for all of that to take place, but it does need the federal government, Baghdad, to allocate a budget for all of these things to take place, and to dedicate a proper committee, not just a committee in name that will deal with this. Somebody told me the other day that 500 committees have been formed in the past few years to deal with various outstanding issues, and nobody knows the result of these committees, their discussions. So what we need is real action. I mean, for the people of those places, it's very, very frustrating because they feel that because they're outside of Kurdistan region, they don't benefit from the security, from the government policies that have shown the Kurdistan region's economy to be booming. They don't benefit from those. At the same time, they feel very neglected by Baghdad. So, you know, I have relatives who still live in Sinjar, or Shingal as we call it in Kurdish. And when you visit there, it's very sad. It's like going back a century in time.
Yes, as you know, I went to Sinjar myself a few years ago, and in 2010, in fact, and it was quite surprising to see how underdeveloped, how neglected it is, and that applies to a number of regions of Iraq that somehow get forgotten. And you have, it's very unfair, yeah, and you find, perhaps to a lesser extent, but that even can happen within the Kurdish region. You find, for example, there's the classic case of Halabja, where development tends not to take place. I think possibly because well, it's only my perspective as an outsider, because the people of Halabja are so radical that they maybe are grumpy and nobody really wants them too much. And so the development tends not to take place, and yet Erbil and Sulaymaniyah are thriving, bustling capitals. I mean, are you somehow committing the crime that the central Iraq does with neglecting your fringed areas?
I don't know when was the last time you visited Halabja, because last time I went was 2013, and it didn't look the way you're describing it, William. Halabja has new roads, new housing, hotels, and in fact earlier this year it was decided that Halabja will become a province. And that will change a lot of things in Halabja. As you may know, every province and therefore every governor in Iraq gets their own budget. So in addition to the KRG budget, Halabja will have the status of a province, and it'll have an additional budget that comes from the federal government. But already, I have to say, we have done a great deal in Halabja. I don't know when the last time was that you were there.
It is a good 5 or 6 years. So things may have improved.
No, they've
I'm
improved.
Really glad to hear it.
They've improved greatly. Of course, the thing is that the people of Halabja have suffered unspeakably. It was a thriving town. It was full of culture. It was a beautiful place. I mean, geographically, that part of Kurdistan is beautiful. It's green, it's mountainous, it's just a picture. And it's so tragic what happened to Halabja. And as you know, 5,000 people were killed. Many, many more were injured, and people are still living with those injuries. And in a way, even though a great deal has been done for Halabja, whatever we do is not enough. Whatever we do for the people of Halabja is not enough.
And Halabja is right up by the Iranian border. In my memory, I remember, well, it's not that recent, but it is again good 4 or 5 years ago, but you had terrible bombing across the Iranian border, or at least shelling of the villages by Iran. You had a similar situation from your Turkish neighbors up north, shelling of Christian villages in the north, Muslim villages on the Iranian border, and some of these beautiful areas being damaged and hurt by your neighbors, allegedly because they were chasing the PKK or PJAK, isn't it? Is the Iranian equivalent. Are you still suffering from this cross-border shelling that you used to get, or is it over now?
Well, we don't have the shelling, and I have to say that our relationship with Turkey is transformed, and we also have a very good relationship with Iran. We are in a difficult neighborhood. I think anyone in the Middle East is in a difficult neighborhood. Our relationship with Turkey, as you've alluded to, was very difficult. And some years ago, around 2008, Turkey had troops massed along the border ready to invade. Today we've managed to turn around our relationship with Turkey so that instead of a military army, we have an army of businessmen from Turkey working in Kurdistan, investing, trading with us, and Turkey in fact is now our biggest trade partner.
They still have troops inside Kurdistan, don't they?
They do. This is a legacy from the 90s. They're still there, but our relationship with Turkey is very, very different now. Prime Minister Erdogan has visited Kurdistan. President Barzani has visited Ankara and Istanbul, and these have been official visits. Late last year, Prime Minister Erdogan and President Barzani met in Diyarbakir, which is the largest Kurdish city in Turkey. This was a historic moment, so there have been a lot of changes. And we also have a good relationship with Iran. Iran is a very important regional player, and again, a very important trade partner for us in Kurdistan, an influential player in Iraq as well as other countries regionally. So we need to have good relations, and we do.
And these countries have their own Kurdish minorities, or in some instances, I mean, they're vast. The number of Kurds in Turkey, I know there's no census, but we're talking at least 20 million, I would imagine. Maybe I'm wrong. I have no clear idea, but there are large numbers of Kurds in Turkey. certainly substantial numbers in Iran and very substantial numbers in Syria. I mean, you're talking 2 or 3 million Kurds in Syria at least. These nations have their own aspirations, the Kurds within these countries. In Syria, they have created an autonomous region, largely under this PYD hegemony, although the KDP, your own political party, has a major role in Syria, and there is a Syrian KDP that is effectively, if you like, a sister party to the Iraq, or the Kurdish KDP in Kurdistan of Iraq. They've carved out between them this autonomous region in Syria that is de facto much like your autonomous region. It may be poorer, it may be suffering tensions with the center, but battles. But you see a kind of a role for a united Kurdistan in the future, bringing in these regions, or how would you envision the future of this broader Kurdistan?
Well, you know, we have these borders that divide Kurdistan between, as you say, Iran, Iraq, Turkey and Syria. But in fact, we're related. We are one family, and many of us are actually related by blood. In my own case, my maternal grandmother was from Syria. I have many relatives who live in Turkey. My husband is from Iran. And my parents were from Sinjar or Shingal in Iraq. So I'm Kurdish from Iraq, but actually I'm Kurdish from all of Kurdistan. And that's true of many, many families and many people in Kurdistan, wherever they're from. And besides being linked by blood as I am, we also are one people. We speak the same language, we have a shared history, and our history is much longer than just the 20th century, where we've been divided. So these borders, we do live with them, they are a reality, but we also have a sort of another reality for ourselves as Kurdish people. How things will turn out in terms of the idea of the nation state and the borders and the politics, it's very, very difficult to predict. Things can change in the Middle East overnight, or they can change incredibly slowly. I'm sure everyone in the Middle East has seen that. So it's very difficult to tell. One thing I've learned, I was a student of history
Yes.
in London University, and one thing I learned is that borders are not sacred. Borders change, empires fall apart and new ones rise up, countries fall apart, new ones rise up. Borders are not sacred, so who knows how things will turn out. People talk about all sorts of possibilities, that there could be autonomous regions in all of these 4 Kurdistans. That's possible. There could be 4 independent Kurdistans one day. There could be a confederation of all of these Kurdistans. I mean, anything is possible, who knows? Or we could stay as we are, that there is this autonomous region, recognized autonomous region in Iraqi Kurdistan. We don't know how things will turn out in Syria. Iran and Turkey will continue as they are. It's a complicated question, and it's asking me to look into a crystal ball. It's very hard to know. And it's hard to know what will happen in the Middle East generally, with the Arab awakening, with this reach for democracy, and then this pushback with authoritarianism. It's hard to know how things will go in the Middle East at all.
But it's certainly true that the Kurdistan region of Iraq has a huge role in Syria today, in so much as you're taking refugees cross-border in a fairly large scale. I'm not saying that there are as many as going to Lebanon or to Jordan, but there, in terms of Kurdish refugees, you're certainly the main point to which people flee, and you're also clearly involved in supporting, supporting certainly the KDP in Syria, which is a major political force. May not be as large as the PYD, which in Syria, but it is significant. And indeed, Masoud Barzani has a kind of role as well, not exactly peacemaker, but a role in terms of he has been hosting conferences, at least in one particular instance, in Erbil, which has brought in Syrian Kurds and has tried to deal with their crisis. So there is, your involvement in Syria is massive, really, at this particular moment of tension, isn't it, really?
We're involved with Syria in terms of taking care of the refugees. We have about 260,000 refugees in Kurdistan. The UN figure is slightly less than that, but that's because they take the registered number. Not everybody registers themselves. That is a very large number for us. And don't forget, that's in addition to 30,000 refugees that we've received from Anbar within Iraq because of the problems recently in Anbar and Fallujah. We also have, since 2003, received tens of thousands, many, many more than that, in fact, Christian refugees and other internally displaced people within Iraq. So, in fact, the Kurdistan region has been taking refugees for 10 years from other parts of Iraq, from the Christians, from Anbar recently, and then, of course, the mass influx of Syrian refugees, the majority of whom that we've received are Kurds, but there are Arabs, there are Alawis, Christians as well. And we Iraqi Kurds have been refugees many times, including myself. So we know what it is to lose everything, not to know what your future is, not to know how long you're going to be in this, a guest in this country, and when you can go back. It's very, very difficult to plan anything when you're in that state. And I think as a result of that, the Kurdish people in Iraq have been very welcoming to the refugees. Our government, the Kurdistan regional government, has been very welcoming. I have to say that the federal government has done very little to assist us, very little proportionately. But we are doing our best, and it is the number of refugees altogether from Syria, the Christians and others, do put a pressure on our services and on our resources as well, but that's just something we have to deal with, and I'm sure other countries like Lebanon, Jordan are having to deal with as well.
It's I mean, curiously enough, the real blame has to be on the international community there, because we have, as an international community, pledged literally billions to relief money and aid money for the Syrian refugees, which simply has never materialized. I mean, that is, I think, a particular source of disgrace that we make these pledges internationally and fail to honour them. But yes, you haven't been getting the support you need to deal with these refugees, clearly.
It's got better recently, I have to say. It's got better recently since we started to make people aware that we had so many refugees, that, you know, this was in addition to all the other refugees that we've been accepting. And we don't have a problem taking the refugees, but we need assistance. You're absolutely right. The situation in Syria also causes us security problems, both in the wider Iraq but also in the Kurdistan region. And we have had to heighten security in the Kurdistan region. We also are a neighbour to Syria, so what happens in Syria will automatically affect us as Kurdistan region and as Iraq. So we're very concerned, like everybody else, about what happens in Syria. With regards to the Kurdish areas of Syria, we would like the people of the Kurdish areas of Syria to have more of a say in how that area is run. That's really the issue for us. We want the administration or the governance of the Kurdish area of Syria to be much more inclusive and democratic. So this is where perhaps from the outside there seems to be a tension, but from our perspective, they are Kurds, we support them, and we are supporting them in any way that we can, both as refugees and other ways that we can as well.
And how are your relationships? I mean, we're talking about, you represent, of course, the whole Kurdish regional government here in the UK, but you also have this other hat you wear as member of the council of the KDP, the Kurdish Democratic Party. Now, that is, as I said, Kurdistan's main political party. But you have other parties, both within Kurdistan and outside. You have the PUK, you have Goran, which it's seminal in terms of Kurdish politics inside Kurdistan. But you also have, you have to relate with, you're dealing with Syria, you have to relate with the PYD, which is, in a sense, a splinter group of the PKK in Turkey. There's a lot of flack. The PKK, another major Kurdish group, a massive Kurdish political party, that are regarded by some in the West as terrorists. Then you have PJAK in Iran, and undoubtedly there are people who are loyal to PJAK who are themselves refugees in KRG. So you have all these big Kurdish political entities. There are, in some instances, huge tensions between some of these groups. I mean, yourselves and PYD, for instance, KDP, PYD relationships are fraught with problems. How do you see this going forward? Do you see some sort of, I don't know, some sort of alliance between these various groups in the longer term?
There may be tensions, but there's always dialogue. We have good relations with almost all of the Kurdish political parties in all of those countries. So there may be tensions on particular issues, but at the end of the day, generally there's dialogue and there is support and a general belief in protecting Kurdish rights wherever there are Kurds. Unfortunately, the 20th century has been very cruel to the Kurds, and we all hope that the 21st century will be better. So there may be tensions on some particular issue here and there, but there's a huge amount of dialogue between various parties. There are visits. Not everything is said in public, by the way, so there may be a lot going on behind the scenes that isn't necessarily made public.
Oh, I hope so. Because you do need, in terms of Syria, you do need the KDP and the PYD to be working together if there's going to be some hope for the stability in the Kurdish region of Syria. And it has been, it's under a lot of pressure, but it is one of the more stable areas of a terribly war-torn country at the moment, isn't it?
It is, but you know, let's, if you're talking about the KDP was at war with the PUK.
Yes.
In the 90s, unfortunately, in Iraqi Kurdistan, we had a civil war. We have gone from a state of civil war to a ceasefire to then two administrations that just worked side by side in Iraqi Kurdistan. This is in the 90s. To 2003, when we started to work together again properly because Iraq was liberated and we needed to work together to bring Iraq back on the constitution and so on, to the point where by 2006 the PUK and KDP, which 10 years earlier had been at civil war, in 2006 we formed a coalition government, and that's where we are today in Iraqi Kurdistan. If you look at the KDP or the KRG's relationship with Turkey, again, as you alluded to earlier, our relationship with Turkey was extremely tense. Today we have high-level visits, we have dialogue, we are talking about energy plans together. So as a party and as a government, we are able to deal with these tense situations. We are able to bring people to the table and to discuss the future, because ultimately what's important for us is the protection of Kurdish rights. That overrides everything for us. Our people have suffered enormously, and we need to make sure that whatever we've achieved, by we I mean the Kurds, wherever we are, whatever we've achieved should be protected, and that should be the minimum of where we are. So yes, there may be tensions, but nothing is impossible. Things change, interests change. Nothing is impossible in politics. And I'm optimistic that all of these things can be overcome. I've already just given you 2 examples where, you know, within the space of 10 years, we went from civil war to being a coalition government. Within the space of 5-6 years, we went from Turkish troops being massed on the border to now being trade partners and talking about cultural exchange and energy plans.
So that is positive. There are, maybe we should talk about social issues for a moment. I mean, one of the things I notice particularly about Erbil when I go there is it's thriving, it's bustling, it's growing, and the same can be said of Sulaymaniyah and of all of the centre of the KRG. It's just remarkable, the development. Heartening. And yet there are a number of little social issues that lurk in the background. I mean, one is the young people. The young people speak no Arabic. You're part of the Kurdish region still remains part of Iraq. Anybody under the age of 35 or something, thereabouts, there's a threshold in there somewhere, speaks no Arabic at all. Very difficult for Kurdistan, therefore, to have a future within Iraq if this is going to go on, this lack of education in Arabic language, wouldn't you say? Or
well, first of all, Iraq has 2 official languages, Kurdish and Arabic. So it's understandable also that a lot of our young people don't speak Arabic. After 1991, when there was a safe haven created and the Kurdistan region effectively came into being, we started for the first time to be able to educate our children in our own language. And so that's where it started, where from 1991 onwards, the schools started to teach in our own language. And I think it's natural for parents to want their children to be educated in their mother tongue. Today, what you find is that people are very excited about learning English. And that's understandable. I think everybody around the Middle East likes to speak English. Personally, I regret for example, don't speak Arabic well enough. I do speak a little bit. I understand much more Arabic than I speak, but that's because I've grown up in Britain, really. So English and Kurdish are my stronger languages. I personally regret that I don't speak Arabic so well. My parents were fluent. I understood from them that Arabic is an incredibly beautiful and rich language and has a beautiful heritage, so I feel that I'm missing out on something. What I think might change the situation in Kurdistan in terms of the Arabic language actually is economics. These days, if you're Kurdish or you live in Kurdistan, if you speak Arabic, Kurdish and English, you can command an incredible salary because you have those 3 languages. So I think a lot of things like that will influence how people, what languages they choose in the end. But I do think it's understandable why the young generation are excited about English rather than Arabic.
it's interesting, and Kurdistan tends to be, maybe I'm wrong in this, so correct me. I would say that Kurdistan tends to be quite a secular society as opposed to mainstream Iraq, or at least as opposed to Shiite Iraq, which is certainly quite religious. There are exceptions. I mean, I think the eastern area of Kurdistan, where you see a lot of these Saudi mosques that the Saudis have built, are they're obviously more old-fashioned and perhaps more conservative, and religion plays more of a part. But would it be fair to say that, in the sense that Britain is a fairly secular society, Kurdistan is a fairly secular society today?
I think it is. I mean, I think you'll find that the people of Kurdistan are very devout, whatever faith they are. The vast majority are Sunni Muslim, but we also have the Faili Kurds, we have Yazidis, we have Christians in Kurdistan. Whatever faith, you find that people are very devout and they will fast and do all of those things. So when we say secular, I don't want people to think that we're like, Sweden or Britain, where perhaps secularism has gone quite far. But we do believe in a secular politics. That doesn't mean that we ignore Islam. There are laws, for example, that still respect Islam, but we also respect democracy. And in fact, the Iraqi constitution itself has one article that says that Islam will be a source for reference for laws, but also that no law shall go against democracy, and that's the situation in Kurdistan as well. We do have some Islamist parties in Kurdistan region,
Yes.
but they tend to be smaller parties, and the main parties are more secular.
Interesting. The situation of women in not just actually in Kurdistan, but in Iraq and in the Middle East as a whole, there is a. I mean, Kurdistan is not unique in having problems with arranged marriages. I know that there are some problems for ladies that get married and then unhappy. And do you feel women's rights are moving forward in Kurdistan?
I would give us a mixed scorecard on women's rights. I think we do very well in certain areas. We have passed many laws, particularly in the past few years, to protect women's rights, to make it much, much more difficult, for example, for men to have more than one wife. We protect women against forced marriage, against child marriage, against FGM. FGM is now banned in Kurdistan. So we have a lot of laws, passed a lot of laws, and of course honor-based violence as well. In Kurdistan, the law says that if a woman is killed because of honor, it's murder, and the sentence will be for murder, and the whole thing will be treated as a murder. I'm afraid that in the rest of Iraq that's not the case. It's much more lenient.
Interesting.
So in the Kurdistan region, I think we've done very well in passing these laws. We have dozens of NGOs that are specifically geared towards protecting women. We have shelters for women who feel threatened. In politics as well, we've taken steps. The Kurdistan Parliament has a quota of 30% women MPs. I think the number is actually higher than that. We have about 35% of MPs that are women in Kurdistan. But by having this quota of 30% in Parliament, it's forced the Kurdish parties to nurture and educate women politicians that maybe they wouldn't have bothered with in the past. And we have women cabinet ministers. We have 14 representatives abroad in total. 4 of us are women.
Yes.
So we do have women in prominent places and protected. However, why do I give a mixed scorecard? I have to be honest and say that while we've passed many very good laws, the implementation hasn't always been easy. You're dealing with issues of culture, of tradition. You're dealing with areas, rural areas, where perhaps the local elder is listened to more than the courts. So these are cultural issues, issues of tradition, where you have to educate people, and that takes time. You're not going to change that kind of culture and tradition overnight.
So you have many issues of tension in this way, social issues with regard to women. I would think that education is the key, isn't it, really, to moving things forward. There can be no other, no matter how you legislate, unless we educate women. If we educate women fully and bring them into the educational system, then these things are going to cease to exist. It has to be the way, isn't it?
Well, I think we've done very well in the Kurdistan region. We've halved the illiteracy rate. So illiteracy is not so high in Kurdistan. But to be honest, I mean, women are heavily involved in education, and I think about half of our university students are female in Kurdistan regions. So in terms of just a straightforward education, I don't think we have a problem. I think where we have a problem is this gradual realization that some things that have been a tradition for a long time, Sometimes people have misunderstood and have thought that it was something that to do with Islam, or it was mentioned in the Holy Quran, but actually it wasn't. So that's where we need to really educate people. And there is a real effort by the KRG, but also by NGOs, to engage, for example, the mullahs, so that they understand and they can explain to people that, look, FGM is not actually in the Quran, that, you know, this is more of a tradition rather than something that came from that direction. So yes, I agree with you. I think we need to, it's a long process. It's very painful because, you know, in the meantime we know that there is FGM going on, and I should make clear that I think some of the NGOs that do reports on FGM in Kurdistan do exaggerate the problem. There are huge swathes of Kurdistan where FGM doesn't exist at all.
Absolutely.
It's never been part of our tradition. In other areas it's very prevalent, but you don't get that nuance when you see these reports. But these are issues that are complicated and difficult to deal with. And we are taking advice from outside experts on how to deal with these issues. So it's not something that we hide from. It's not something that we sweep under the carpet. We recognize that they exist and we are trying to deal with them. But they're difficult and it will take time.
The thing that really encourages me, however, with regard to Kurdistan, like the Kurdish region, is not your economic development, it's not your social development, it is your tolerance, actually. I do think the real beacon of hope, the great thing about the Kurdish region is that you have these minorities. You have the Christians, you have the Yazidis, you have the other Shabak, these extraordinary minorities, as you said, the Fela Kurds, and your refugees, refugees from the rest of Iraq as well. This immense sense that Kurdistan is a safe haven where anybody can go and feel safe and have a future is the most encouraging thing, I think, about the Kurdish region. And it really is inspirational because it doesn't happen everywhere. It doesn't even happen in Britain because we're tending to get quite little Englandish about our approach to life. So that's really encouraging. What is perhaps a final thought? I mean, if you had a final thought, Bayan, from this interview, is there anything you'd like to highlight about Kurdistan's future?
Well, 2 or 3 things actually relating to your last comment. One is about the economy. You know, Kurdistan was absolutely devastated. Sometimes people talk about we're rebuilding Kurdistan. We're not rebuilding. There was nothing to rebuild. We're building from scratch. Kurdistan was devastated by the genocide that went on for decades. It started in the 50s and 60s in different waves, and by the 80s it was at its peak between around 1976 and say 1988. 4,500 villages were destroyed in Kurdistan. By destroyed, I mean bulldozed, razed to the ground, the wells and the water poisoned, and there was an order that anybody that tried to farm their land would be shot on sight. So this destroyed the rural way of life, it destroyed the agriculture of Kurdistan, and that was the main industry in Kurdistan. About 70% of the workforce used to work in agriculture in Kurdistan. So as well as the people that were killed, the environment was destroyed in Kurdistan. Today we're talking about 45 billion barrels of oil reserves in Kurdistan. This was completely neglected. Nobody touched this oil because Saddam was afraid that if oil came out of Kurdistan, the Kurds would do whatever with it. So it was completely neglected. We don't quite know yet what mining resources we have in Kurdistan. That'll be the next big discovery for us and for the world, hopefully. So our economy was below zero. And we've been able to have about 8 to 10% GDP growth in Kurdistan over the last decade, year on year. We have started an oil and gas industry more or less from scratch from about 2006 or 7. We have a very friendly investment law that's encouraged investment from Lebanon, from the Gulf, from Turkey, from Europe, from Britain. So we have, through using our laws and our very friendly attitude to foreigners and to foreign expertise and investment and trade, we've been able to turn our economy round from being one that was deprived, people living in poverty, to one now where we have employment, we have foreign oil companies working with us, and we have a bright future economically. In terms of the tolerance that you mentioned, this is something that we're very proud of. I have to say that it's something that we just took in our stride and thought of as very normal until people started telling us, wow, you're so tolerant. And we are very proud of it, but we protect the rights of minorities. For example, in our parliament, which has 111 seats, 11 of those seats are allocated to the Christians, Turkmen, to the minorities effectively. So they get those 11 seats no matter how many votes they get. And this is something that will not change. If anything, it'll probably improve from their perspective. There are TV and radio stations broadcasting in different languages in Kurdistan. Children can be taught in the Assyrian language, Ashuri. So yes, it's something that we're very proud of, and it's something that we want to protect in Kurdistan.
Well, that's a real blessing. It really is. It's a joy to have you with us. It's a joy to hear about Kurdistan and the way Kurdistan is moving forward today. Bless you. Bayan, Sami, Abdul, Rahman, thank you very much for being our guest today on ANN.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.